And now I'm honored to introduce our speaker for today, Amelia Bland-Waller, who was here in the very early stages of the from UUCH, from what I understand. And she now lives in Grayson County, but she has come all the way to speak to us today about Shinto, which I don't know very much about, but I'm eager to learn more. Amelia?
Don, thank you. It's so good to see so many of you, and I feel so honored to be invited back. My heart really is here, and some of you know, I know Mike knows and Jane knows, we started, a friend and I started a UU congregation in Independence in Grayson County, and we met once a month for 7 years. But we were getting kind of winding to where we weren't getting too many folks, and then COVID came, and that kind of put the death knell on everything. So we donated our treasury to various food banks and other things in the area, and I miss it. I miss it very much, and I look forward to opportunities to come back here. Why do I call myself a cultural Christian? I'm sure there are some among you who feel like that is an apt description. I was raised Methodist. My father was from Grayson County, and so that side of the family was Baptist. They don't always call themselves Baptist, but they are. And but I was raised Methodist, as my mother had been in Maryland, and had perfect attendance, was baptized by sprinkling, had perfect attendance up until, I don't know, 8th grade or something, and my mother was very involved in the church. And her family lived in Silver Spring, Maryland, and there was some diversity in the neighborhood in the 60s and 70s. She had some friends, the Yazers, who were Jewish, and I was aware, that there were other religions besides Methodist and Baptist, and there were some Catholics in our family. But I went off to I graduated high school from Independence High School and went off to college at UVA thinking that everybody was Christian, that Jews were Christian. I didn't know any different. I mean, I was immersed in it. That was all I knew. And then in law school, I went to law school at UVA, and I made a really good friend who is Jewish, but not really observant. And I began to learn some things. So in 1985, I graduated law school, and I was working out of a law firm in Wilmington, Delaware. And I come in one day in October, and nobody's there. I'm like, what's going on? And the secretary says, and I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing this properly, Yom Kippur. And I'm like, what? Yes, Yom Kippur. And I'm like, well, what's that? And so I called my friend up from law school, at this point it's in Palm Beach, Florida, and I said, do you know what this is? And he was laughing, and I said, and Wendy Cohen isn't here today. I didn't know she was Jewish. So, my eyes kind of got opened when I moved to Delaware, but that's the furthest north I've ever resided. I had kind of fallen away from church in Delaware. I was in counseling, and my counselor said, Amelia, I think it would help you to have some spiritual support. And so she recommended the UUCH in Newark, Delaware, which is where the University of Delaware is located, and I started going and loved it. I mean, I feel like it literally saved my life. It was like I couldn't believe that it was there, and it was a pretty good-sized fellowship. But I digress. I want to give you that background so you understand just how naive I've been for a whole lot of my life. I mean, I've been at UU now for almost 40 years, so I've learned a lot about other religious traditions. And I was telling my friend Ed in the back, when my husband and we've been married 16 years, but when we started dating again, we had dated in high school, I was explaining to him about, the other religions and major world religions and how they've evolved and things. And he's lived in Elk Creek all his life, goes to essentially a Baptist church. And he looks at me and he says, why don't they teach this in school? And he'd be the first to say, if he was born in India, he'd likely be Hindu. If he was born, he understands that it's the water he swims in. But he doesn't step on my toes. I go to an evangelical church with him, and I just put on my little UU hat and translate things and, pick out what resonates for me. But I have had a lot of religious exploration, and I do consider myself, because of my thorough enculturation, to be more or less a Christian UU/humanist. But I want to tell you about Shinto and how I came to learn about Shinto. And it starts with a relationship. Okay, I've already explained that. Okay, these people, and they're the same people in both pictures. That man on the left is my dad's 9-year older brother. My dad was an oops baby. His brothers were 21, 15, and 9 years older than him, so he was not really planned. But that's his 9-year older brother, Gerald Bland, and his lovely wife, whom I grew up calling Jeannie. Her name is Hime, and it means princess in Japanese. This is the picture where they were married in Tokyo, and I learned just in the last few years the dress she is wearing is a dress my Granny Bland from Elk Creek, Virginia, sent her to wear for her wedding. As you can see on the right, they met during World War II when my uncle was stationed in Pacific Theater, as Jane mentioned. He was actually on the beach in Normandy on D-Day. I knew about them. These pictures sat on my granny's piano all my life. I knew about them. We exchanged Christmas cards. They always, as a child, I still have the doll they sent me for my first Christmas. They never had children, but they were very generous and loving people. And so I didn't know a whole lot about them, but my granny told me that she had offered them land when they came to the United States in 1960 to build on her farm in Elk Creek, which I own now. And I think very wisely, they decided to go to Tacoma, Washington. There's a large joint military base out there. Tacoma in the 50s and 60s was so many Japanese folks, and there's still around Seattle, Tacoma, huge numbers of Asian people, and it was a very good choice for them and for her in particular. They were married 60 years, and in looking at, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so I know who they are, and their significance. The only time I ever met them in person as a child was they drove cross country in 1974 to visit my granny one last time. Apparently my uncle had some aversion to flying. So they drove all the way across the country, and I got to meet them at my granny's house. And that was the first time I'd ever seen them in person, even though I knew who they were. We'd call them on holidays and Hi, Aunt Jeannie, Well, about late 80s, all of a sudden, Jeannie becomes Hime, and I was like, hooray, what is this name? But she was really reclaiming her Japanese heritage and felt like she could do that. So fast forward, I'm an attorney in Marion. This is before I went to work for the Attorney General's office, and they asked me if I would serve as their executor for their will. And at this point, they're probably in their 70s. And I'm like, sure. So, I draft all that up and things. And it occurs to me that they want to make a bequest to family in Japan. But, I'm young. I have a practice to run, family to raise. I don't give it any thought. Well, fast forward to 2013. Gerald dies. He's 93 years old. Okay. At that time, Aunt Hime is 88. We're not in frequent contact. You know, they're distant. They live on the other side of the world. But my aunt calls me and she tells me, and it turns out my uncle had made a provision in his final wishes that family in Virginia not be contacted for 30 days after he died. Which, you know, my cousin and I, who is our uncle's namesake, you know, he was kind of hurt by that. But Himmy explained to us he didn't want to inconvenience us. And so, and still, that was kind of a hard thing to swallow, you know. He had a military funeral. She shared photographs with us and things. But so my cousin, whose name is Gerald Christopher Bland, named after Uncle Gerald, he and I flew out there in 2013, and we learned that our uncle had cancer. And realizing that he was going to die, they had sold their house in Graham, Washington, in Pierce County, Washington, and had moved into an apartment beside their big Baptist church. It's not really a mega church, but it's a big church. And what they had done was my uncle had put all these things in place for Aunt Hime because he knew he was dying, and she, being a nurse, she had the little journal where she kept his stats, you know, every few minutes, and he died in a hospital bed in their living room. So again, I mean, it's very enigmatic to me. I don't know much about them at all, but we went out there, and my cousin suggested, he's 10 years older than I am, and he said, let's get Aunt Hime to take us to a Japanese garden. So we went to a Japanese garden. There's a big park in Tacoma, and as part of that, there's a beautiful Japanese garden, and we're walking through, and she's pointing things out, and they're talking about, he knows a little bit more than I do, but not much. And my cousin says to me, we fall back a bit, and he says, what do you think the deal is about her family? You know, we don't know anything about it. I'm like, tell me about it. I got to find these people when Aunt Hime died. She can't live forever, you know, assuming I outlive her, which at her rate wasn't necessarily going to happen because she's in great shape. And he said, he said, I guess the religious difference is a thing. You know, my uncle, being raised in Elk Creek, Virginia, was Baptist. And when they came back, I don't know if it happened right away, but my aunt was baptized in Washington, and she taught a Bible study class to Japanese women at her church. So she converted to Christianity, but my cousin says to me, what do you think the family is? And he said, do you think they're Buddhist? And I'm like, I don't know. He said, what about Shinto? Could they be Shinto? And this little bell went off like, what is Shinto? I mean, I've been around you know, all this time, at that point 30 years, and I knew what a torii gate was, but that was like, I knew what it looked like, but I knew nothing about that religion, so or that tradition, I should say. It's not really a religion. So while we're out there, I got to visit Hime's friends, and it turned out she had a really deep network at her church. Other friends where they were white military guys had married Japanese wives, you know, about the same time. And so I got to meet them and got to go to her church and meet her pastor. And then for a period of 8-9 years, you know, I was in frequent contact with my aunt because even though I was here, she had a lot of confidence in my ability to help her navigate things. She was pretty savvy, though. I mean, she knew what she was doing. Well, she started getting deaf, and it got harder to talk on the phone, but she could write very well in English. She'd taken a lot of classes, gotten naturalized. And then I was teaching at the law school in Grundy in March of 2020, and guess what happens in March of 2020? We get a decree we've got to teach Friday, Saturday, Sunday straight through, because we've got to get the requisite number of hours in that we can go to distance learning for our law students. You know, the ABA requires so many hours, in-class hours. So I'm gearing up from that and doing combined classes, just trying to cram stuff in. And I get the phone call from Hemi's friend, Amelia. I think Hemi needs help. Okay, what's going on? Well, she's driving her car to the grocery store and getting lost. And I mean, everything she needed was within just a few miles of her house. And we're worried she's not eating properly and things like that. So what could I do? It's March. It's like the start of the pandemic. And so I'm researching assisted living facilities, trying to figure out, you know, what I can do. And I didn't go out. As it turned, I sent them money to buy some food for her. But I couldn't go out until October. And my eldest son owns Smith County Animal Hospital in Marion. He's a veterinarian, so he fixed me up. I just want to show you a couple other pictures of my Aunt Hemi when I went out from her uncle's death, and that's my husband with her. I tell you, she was in good shape. At 95, she was line dancing 3 nights a week. And she had the keys to the church for the line dancers. So at her funeral, everybody was praising, you know, how she had inspired them all those years. So I get on the plane and I'm thinking, you know, the last thing in the world I want to do is take my 95-year-old aunt COVID. So I've got on, you know, surgical booties, double mask, helmet, stuff on my head. I go straight to take a shower. You know, I finally go out to see her. She was expecting me. And after we exchanged a few pleasantries, and here I'm thinking, how am I going to break this to her, you know, that it's time to maybe thinking about moving out of the apartment. She's asked me how my husband is, how my sister is, and then she says, Amelia, there's a place I'd like you to go look at with me. I'm thinking about moving there. A week later, we went and looked, she signed the lease, and a week later I'm hiring somebody to help me move her sofa and empty her apartment, and I rented a U-Haul and got her there, and it was one of the, I couldn't go in, but they took her in, you know, did all the COVID testing and things, and then I hung around there a while, and my husband flew out, and we drove her car across country back to Virginia with what we could salvage from the apartment that I thought would be, you know, important. I mean, certainly we furnished her place at assisted living, but there were documents and things that I needed, and boy, did I hit a treasure trove. So I'm still thinking I need to let her family in Japan know something. And when I'm going through her papers, she's corresponding with umpteen people in Japan. I don't know who they are. I can't read their names. She's very rapidly getting to the point where she can't tell me their names. Her friend was able to read from her address book and give me some idea of who the names were. But, you know, I'm trying to place these people together, and then I found in a trunk with what's called a family register. That's like the Bureau of Vital Records in the United States, only in Japan they keep a family register. So I'm starting to figure out these relationships, and I was going out there pretty often, every 3-4 months or so, just to check on her and get her settled and things. And I hear on the radio, on NPR, about a program in Seattle where they're trying to document Japanese internees' oral histories while they're still alive. And I think, you know, I don't know where to start. Where do you? I'm in Seattle. Surely I can find a Japanese translator somewhere. So I call this. I think it was called it wasn't bento because it's like lunch, but it was like benkyo. And I call them up and I explain to the woman what's going on, and she says, "Well, you know, I'm sorry, that's really not in our purview. I don't really have any suggestions." And I hang up the phone. Well, 5 minutes later, she calls me back. She says, I have a friend who's a corporate translator in Seattle, and her mother, who's elderly, still lives in Japan. Let me give her your number. And thus ensued my 3-year relationship with the most fabulous Japanese translator who ever lived, who was so helpful. And she helped me draft a letter. You know, I'm sending these letters off to addresses that I found in Japan, but I'm sending them off not knowing exactly who's who, but somebody is going to stick. And she gave me tips like to be sure and put her old address and her new address. And because she said people get unsolicited letters, I guess it's like those of us who get letters, do you want to sell your land? You know, some of us get those. And so, I mean, and she knew the protocol. So immediately I get responses from her family, and I recognized the one friend as the person that she had named as her family contact. It was her nephew in Japan. So I'm going back and forth. I'm getting to know the Japanese ladies, because there were a lot of Japanese ladies at her assisted living facility. It turned out she'd had a friend who had lived there for 3 years, and she had visited the friend, so she knew the place, and she thought it was a good place. So that's all well and good, going great. And then I'm out there with her trying to get hearing aids, trying to get, doctors and things like that. And she turns around and she starts talking to me in Japanese. And this, I think, was January, February of 21, and I'm like, okay, I guess I better start learning some Japanese. Because how am I going to talk to her? And so I started learning Japanese and became increasingly interested in Japan and its culture. I want to show you, this was something that I did not know. We think of Japan as a small place. The North Japan is about the same, would that be latitude, as Canada. And then Southern Japan goes what would be down into Mexico. It's a lot bigger country than what we imagine. And there are several regions in Japan. I've met now some of Hime's friends were from Okinawa. She was from area 2 on that map. Tokyo's about in the middle there, 3 and 4 on the island of Honshu. But basically, Japan is an archipelago, is that how you pronounce that word? Of islands. And so I'm starting to learn about Japan. Well, Hime continued to decline. I got the call in July of 2022 that she'd been wandering, and they were going to move her to the memory care unit. So I went out, and again, downsizing. Her church took a lot of her furniture, but again, lots of papers, lots of pictures, lots of documents that I shipped home to myself, and now I'm getting some communication going with her family. And in fact, the first time I spoke with her nephew with our interpreter on the phone, she got off and she said, Amelia, he has the most delightful sense of humor. And he had said during the conversation, something was said about January and snow, and he was like, yeah, we have 15 feet here right now, because he lives in northern Japan. But he was laughing about the fact that his birthday falls on the Japanese emperor's birthday, which is a national holiday in Japan. So, and he was making a joke about how they have a national holiday on his birthday. So, I knew that these were lovely people and they were interested in communicating with me, and so I just needed to figure out how. Well, Anne Hime did pass away in January of 23. It was a year this January. And it was pretty fast when she went to memory care. I mean, she was falling often, having to go to the emergency room. We had a padded helmet and things on the floor and pads on the floor and things. And she got to where she couldn't even really sit up or swallow and was no longer verbal. But I went out for her 98th birthday on January 5th, 2023, and we had a little birthday party. And some of her friends from the church came, and I looked back at the video. We were singing happy birthday to her, and she's moving her lips and saying the words to happy birthday, so she was still in there. And that day, she wanted to go outside, and she walked outside with the walker, and the physical therapist came back and said, I didn't think I'd ever see her walk again. You know, she'd been bedridden. Well, so that was a wonderful, wonderful day. I brought her roses, and she clearly said, she smelled the roses, and she said, beautiful. Next day, off a cliff. And hospice came in, and I just sat with her and sang to her. My uncle, Gerald, good boy from Grayson County, played the guitar and sang old hymns like The Old Rugged Cross or In the Garden. And that's what I sang to her, you know, while she died. Still, excellent blood pressure, excellent heart rate, you know, but things just weren't working anymore. And I found out later that her younger sister had died the year before, also from some type of dementia. But, you know, we all have our vulnerabilities. So I decided I am going to Japan. I've got to go now at this point. I've been studying Japanese. I'm like, I am going. And I went then the October after she died, and we're going to talk about what's the difference. Okay, these are some pictures from my trip. And these are the torii gates that we all recognize, and that's Shinto. And the torii gates are at Shinto shrines. There are Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples, all right? Now, I read something this morning that really upset me a little bit, but Japan is kind of like Grayson County in that we're all getting older. Parts of Japan, people are getting older, the population's falling, so they're relying on tourism, just like a lot of Southwest Virginia. Oh, well, we'll keep our economy going, we'll get the tourists in here. Well, last week, a tourist from America, a 65-year-old man, carved his initials with his fingernail into the Meiji Shrine torii gate, and they caught him. They had cameras, and they caught him, and he was arrested. But, you know, that kind of stuff just makes me want to cringe, because I was told by our tour guide, you know, that it was important to bow at the gate, and you go through this whole purification thing. But I want to show you then the difference between what a Shinto shrine looks like, and that is the Buddhist temple in Nara, where they have the deer. Very, very ornate architecture. I got this calendar there with different statues. I mean, just majestic. And that is that. Pardon me? Oh, yes. Just majestic art and structures and things. But when you go to a Shinto shrine, it's more emphasis on the environment and the natural world. And so I'm thinking, well, what's the difference between these two things? You know, what is different? And I found out, and I know that Chris Barnett knows this because he shared it with me, Shinto is the ancestral indigenous religion of Japan. It's kind of like, in some ways, like Native American spirituality. And up until the 6th century, there was no name for Shinto. It was no, I mean, what to call it is the way of the kami, which is the word for gods. And I sometimes listen to Bible Broadcasting Network in Japanese just for the listening practice. And they, even on the Christian Japanese broadcasting, they call God kami. So they still use that terminology. But in the Shinto tradition, it's more like the spirits, and everything has a spirit. Rocks have spirit. Water has spirit. And so it's a very different orientation. There's no, it's prehistoric. It's before they were even literate. They don't have a founder. They don't have sacred texts. They do have a priesthood, and they do celebrate some rituals. But it was just an inseparable part of Japan for millennia. And then around 500, the latter end of the 6th century, Buddhism was introduced from China, and that was when Shinto was named to differentiate it from, as distinct from Buddhism. And the characters that are used for the word Shinto are Chinese characters that basically say, the way of the divine, or the way, and the word for kami. So here I am in Japan, and we did a lot of other fun things too. We got to meet retired sumo wrestlers, and they were great. The people in our group were like, we're going to go meet sumo wrestlers. They were great. They fixed us lunch. They showed us their moves. They were wonderful. We got to visit a family, and they dressed us in kimono. We just got to do so many fabulous things and go to the countryside, to the parks, to all over the place. It was like, I told my husband, I woke up every morning like I was 8 years old at summer camp, like, what are we going to do today? It was wonderful. But let's see. Let me not get too far afield about Shinto. One thing you need to understand about Japan, modern Japan, is all of that is very syncretic. It's close to 20% of Japanese citizens would count themselves as atheists, and up to 56% would count themselves as not religious. And you say, how can this be? Everywhere you turn, there. Little street side altars and altars in the home. The family we visited, the little altars in the home, they venerate ancestors. How can this be that they're not religious? But what they've done is it's become enculturated in them, much as Christianity became enculturated in me through tradition and practice, and so. It's difficult, I think, for Westerners to understand how the Japanese how that kind of developed. They say, I've heard Japanese people say, you're born Shinto, but you die Buddhist. And when my Hime's nephew died in Japan last year, they sent me pictures from his funeral, and it was all Buddhist. The big portraits of the ancestors and the chrysanthemums, and, it was very obviously a Buddhist funeral. The Japanese imperial family derives from Shinto beliefs. The underlying creation story is that there was a family, kind of like we talked about Adam and Eve, but Amaterasu, I'm probably not saying that right, was the sun goddess. And Japan is the land of the rising sun. The emperor was believed to have descended from the royal family, much like, other royal families descend with the divine right of kings. That changed some in modern times. The emperor has disclaimed supernatural lineage, but they're still recognized, and it's all through the paternal line. And they're kind of at a rough point right now because there aren't that many royal men still left in the royal family, so they may have to, do some finagling on that. Okay, so let me wrap up and show you what came out of all this. I did, while I was in Kyoto, I did get to meet Hime's niece. That's her on the right. And, of course, I had to find an interpreter, which I was able to do on the fly. Kyoto's a big city. Tokyo is too. Tokyo's 3 times the size of New York. But you can walk on the street at night in most of Tokyo. It's quiet. It's clean. It's unbelievable. And I was in Manhattan 2 weeks ago, and I was like, there's just no comparison. But anyway, I got to meet them, and it was lovely. The interpreter was very good, and we were able to talk. And they gave me, I brought them some old family photos that I had found in Hime's things that I didn't know who they were, and I brought them to them. And they gave me this photo, which was taken right when my aunt and uncle became engaged and were announced they were getting married. They went to visit her family in Akita Prefecture. That's my uncle, the tall guy, smiling guy in the back. And then Hime's, the dark-headed woman in front of him. And the niece that I showed you that I met is one of these little girls. I don't know which one. But they shared that with me and wanted me to have it, and I appreciated it very much. Okay, so I come back from Japan. This is late October last year. And guess what happens to Amelia? Let me see if I can Yeah, this is what happens to Amelia. Any of you remember that scene from Close Encounters of the Third Kind? That's me. And my husband's looking at me like I've lost my mind. Did you get to see Terry Garr there, give him the look like, what is going on with you? Yeah, that's me. I come back from Japan like that. So I told you that I had inherited my grandmother's house, and I operated an Airbnb there. And in the backyard, there was a dilapidated chicken coop, and I knew up behind that chicken coop were some springs because my granny had spring-fed water for 55 years until I put it in a well. So, tear down the chicken coop, go up around the springs, and start building. And I don't know how to make that a slide now. From current slide. Took out a bunch, well, that's me now. Took out a bunch of trees. Nobody even walked back in there in 20 years. Just enough to clear for a pond. And I've got a little pond with fish in it. And built a bridge. And then this is fun. Emily will appreciate this because she's met my husband. Here's my good husband building my torii gate. Yeah, so I've got a torii gate, and on the other side, I've got on the other side of the pond, I've got some golden cranes that are lit at night, and if you know Japan, that's very significant Japanese symbolism. But when I tell my friends I built this garden, they're like, oh, is it a Zen garden? I'm like, no, it's not Zen. There are no statues of Buddha. It's a Shinto-inspired garden. And I'm having so much fun just finding plants and putting things in it, crawling around under trees, breaking off branches that were to the ground. Next month, I'm going back to Japan. This is my final slide. I found a language school in Akita. I'll be the oldest person there. But they let me come. They really wanted to see my traveler's insurance. I'll be sleeping on a tatami mat. I'll be riding a bike to class, and then there will be snow. So it's going to be fun. But I'm going to spend almost the entire month of December. Now, the slide I showed you of the nephew and or the niece and husband, he wanted to get together with me, but I'm telling them, I'm not ready. I want to be able to visit the farm, which has been in my Aunt Hemme's family now for 6 generations. They still live there. They're rice farmers. I said, I want to be able to come and be able to converse with you. So that's my story, and that's what I've learned about Shinto, and there's a whole lot more to know, and I recommended it to any of you. If you want to sit in a quiet place and feel spirits, it's a great tradition to learn more about. Thank you.